Hi, and welcome back to Perspectives. Today, let's talk about prisons and jails.
So, the use of prisons as a place of punishment is a relatively new way to handle offenders. It's really only about 200 years old. Prior to prisons, America followed the Europeans using this corporal punishment, so flogging, whipping, mutilation, things like breaking a hand, branding, workhouses. Remember that workhouses, it was thought that poverty was a direct result of laziness. And exile, along comes the Enlightenment around the 18th century, and it really challenged these old traditions with kind of these new ideas of rationalism. And it also affected the way that we viewed criminal justice, particularly in the area of corrections. So we really see the first prisons starting to arise during this time. So a prison is a state or federal confinement facility that has custodial authority over adults sentenced to confinement. Before we really dive down deeper into prisons, I wanted to talk about the recidivism rate for just a moment. So 44% of released prisoners are going to be rearrested within the first year of their release. This is referred to as the 1-year recidivism rate. Within 3 years, an additional 25% will return to prison, raising the 3-year recidivism rate to 69%. So stated differently, within 3 years, 69% of all individuals released from prison will return to the criminal justice system. So as you can see, the imprisonment rate nearly quadrupled between 1980 and around 2005 to 2007-ish. This is largely the result of the war on drugs. Overcrowding became so serious of an issue that 40 states and DC were actually operating under a court order to alleviate crowding. So the entire prison system in 9 states were so overcrowded that they came under control of the court. So this is where we really started seeing tent cities and stacking prisoners. But as you can see, we've had significant declines since then. So let's talk about some of the characteristics of U.S. prisons. And these numbers are taken from the Bureau of Justice Statistics in a report that was dated 2017. So there are 110 federal prisons and 1,833 state prisons. The average cost to imprison someone for a year is approximately $31,000 at the state level and about $34,500 at the federal level. In Georgia, we're on the low end. We're at about $20,000 a year. In 2017, state prison population was around 1.4 million. Federal is about 166,000. And it's important to note that these numbers here, they're declining. More than half of state prisoners, 55%, are serving sentences for violent offenses. Half of federal prisoners are serving a sentence for drug trafficking offenses. So males are largely the prison population, about 93%. Females made up 7% of the prison population at year end 2017. The imprisonment rate for black males is about 2,336 per 100,000 black males in the U.S. That's almost 6 times the rate of sentenced white males, 397 per 100,000. Let's take a look at a chart. So while there is still significant disparity with African Americans being sentenced at a much higher rate, there is good news. So racial disparity has actually decreased for all major crimes, but especially for drug crimes. So in 2007, African American males were 15 times more likely than white males to be in prison for drug crimes. By 2016, that dropped to only 5 times more likely. Across all crimes, it used to be that in 2000 we saw African Americans were incarcerated or imprisoned at 9 times the rate of whites. And this disparity, as we talked about on the last slide, is down to 6-to-1 ratio. And this represents that 30% decline. So again, still disproportionate, but overall declining. The disparity is declining. So if we look specifically at state prison systems, we find that there are 3 security levels: maximum, medium, and minimum. Maximum security, most maximum security institutions tend to be these massive old buildings with large inmate population, and they do include all death row inmates. And you're going to see that, like, the high fences, the walls of concrete, barriers between living areas, secure cells, armed guards, and like the gun towers. In medium security, they're similar in design to maximum security facilities, but they usually have more windows and tend to have barbed wire fences instead of these large stone walls. And oftentimes they'll use these dormitory style housing. In medium security prisoners, have more freedom, so they can associate with other prisoners. They can go to the prison yard or the exercise room, visit the library. Showering and using bathroom facilities has less supervision. In minimum security, the housing tends to be completely dormitory style. Prisoners usually have freedom of movement within the facility. Work is done under general supervision only. Typically guards are unarmed and the gun towers don't exist. Fences, if they exist, they're low and sometimes unlocked. And one of the most important security tools is the count. Counts aren't typically done at minimum security. And even prisoners are sometimes allowed to wear their own clothes. But let's talk about the count for just a second. So the count is a security tool. So it's the process of counting inmates during the course of a day. And times are random. All business is going to stop until the count is verified. So at some point or points of time in the day, there's going to be an alert and everybody has to stop exactly where they are, and this process of the count takes place. So even if you are there visiting and a count occurs, you are stuck until that count is over. And if there is even one inmate discrepancy, that count will continue and the whole thing is locked down until they can account for everyone who's supposed to be in that prison. The federal prison system classifies its institutions according to 5 security levels. So you have ADMAX, high security, this would be like U.S. penitentiaries. Medium security, these are correctional institutions. Low security, also a correctional institution. And minimum security, so these are like federal prison camps. Additionally, there are administrative facilities like metropolitan detention centers where they're held for trial, and medical centers for federal prisoners who have some type of special need. So ADMAX was opened in 1995. It's in Florence, Colorado. It's ultra high security. There's only 575 beds. It's a huge facility and it's only 575 beds. And inmates are confined to their cells 23 hours per day, and then they have to go outside for 1 hour. They cannot associate with one another, and it really holds the toughest, the worst of the worst, about the worst of the worst. So it's about 1% of federal prison population is confined there. So it's going to hold mob bosses, spies, terrorists, murderers, escape artists. I think El Chapo is held there. As a matter of fact, he is held there. So it is really kind of the supermax facility. In high security, there are actually 8 high security facilities within the federal system, one of which is Atlanta, Georgia. And it actually looks like an old courthouse from the street. So the high security prisons, they really only hold about 10% of the prison population. They're really designed to prevent escapes and disturbances. They use a lot of massive electronic surveillance, armed perimeter patrols. Now, in 1987 in Atlanta, we had the huge prison riot. About 2,500 Cuban nationals were placed into prison because they were part of the Mario boat lift, so they had actually committed a felony since being placed on immigration patrol. So it wasn't like all of the immigrants that came over. So in 1987, Cuba emptied their prisons and they stuck them on rafts and they sent them to the United States. And it was an extremely dangerous situation. Many people lost their life. But the U.S. had kind of a difficulty of figuring out what to do. But if they had committed a felony since they had been placed on this immigration parole since they arrived, they were housed in Atlanta's prison. So there was an uprising that lasted about 11 days, and they actually burned down most of the Atlanta federal prison. They took hostages. So eventually FBI negotiators had to bring in the military to quell the riot. So it was an interesting time in Atlanta's history and the federal prison system's history. In medium security, there's about 26 facilities. They hold about 23% of the federal population. And they're really guarded by these like double chain link fences, electronic monitoring of the grounds. There are really only 17 low security facilities, but they do hold 28% of the federal prison population. And these federal prison camps, there are 55 of them, and they hold about 35% of the prison population for the feds. Two of them, one's Elgin Air Force Base in Florida, another one's Maxwell Air Force Base in Alabama. Essentially, they're just unfenced honor type camps using barrack-style housing. Now, the medical centers are really for those kind of special needs prisoners, so older prisoners that have health issues. The detention centers are just that. They're there to hold people prior to trial. So before we talk about jails, let's talk a little bit about prison life and culture, and then what it is like for a male inmate in prison. So all prisoners, when they come into prison, they go through a prison classification system. And this is really to determine which custody level to assign an inmate to. And it's based on offense history, the assessed dangerousness of the individual, their perceived risk of escape, and, a whole bunch of kind of other little factors. And these little factors include race. Race plays a big part in where they're going to be classified and who they're going to be grouped with. Gang affiliation also has to be looked at. Inmates may move among security levels depending on their behavior, but internal classification systems determine the placement and the program assignment within the institution that they're primarily housed in. So we have kind of two placements. We have external placement or initial placement, and this is where the which institution to place the offender in, and then you have internal, and this is where they're going to go within an institution. So let me give you a few key definitions before we kind of proceed through this. First, order. Order is the absence of individual or group misconduct that threatens the safety of others. So when we say order, we're talking about the absence of misconduct. Amenities. Amenities are anything that enhances the comfort of inmates. Now, I know that sounds a little funny, right? Why would we want to enhance the comfort of inmates? Well, amenities are great because they help control behavior. So when you don't have a lot, you would be really surprised how an hour television program can become very, very important. And you can threaten to take away that hour-long program for behavior, and that will actually bring somebody in line. So amenities are actually important to the overall prison system. And service. Service are programs that are designed to improve the lives of inmates. So this would be like vocational training, education, work opportunities within the prison, and really those reintegration strategies that we mentioned in the last PowerPoint presentation. So there are three models of incarceration. Generally, you don't see a pure type in any one institution. You'll have these different models kind of throughout a prison system. So the first one is a custodial model. So this assumes that prisoners have been incarcerated for the purpose of either incapacitation, deterrence, or retribution. And here they're going to emphasize security, discipline, order, right? So the discipline is strict. Almost all behavior is regulated. And this is really indicative of what a maximum security prison would look like, how it would operate. The next model is the rehabilitation model. So this emphasizes treatment programs, and it's designed to reform the offender, right? So treatment remains in prisons today, but few prisons actually conform to a 100% rehabilitative model today. While rehabilitation is in most prisons, there isn't like a wholly rehabilitative prison. Now we also have the reintegration model. So this emphasizes the offender's ties to family and community. And it's a model that really gradually gives inmates greater freedom and responsibility during their confinement. So they might go from kind of the strictest control to more of a medium security to work release to a halfway house, then on to community supervision. So let's talk about use of force in prison. So correctional officers, they're unarmed. And they're outnumbered, but they're expected to maintain order and enforce prison rules. So they can use force in a few situations. So the first one is, of course, in defense of self. I couldn't find any really great updated stats for this, but in 2003, one study found that it's about 18,000 assaults per year on correctional officers. They can use force in defense of a third person. Now they can use force to uphold prison rules, and they can use force in the prevention of a crime. So destruction of property, assault, rape, and they can also use it in the prevention of escapes. It used to be that they were able to use deadly force, but now deadly force is limited to only prisoners that are fleeing that are thought to be dangerous, and some jurisdictions require warning shots. So now remember, back when we were talking about police are not allowed to use warning shots. And here in the prison arena, correctional officers may actually be required to use warning shots. So if we look at illness within prison, we look at about 1.9% HIV positive, another 0.5% has full-blown AIDS. Interestingly enough, only 19 states require testing. HIV/AIDS, and oftentimes it's testing when they come in, not when they leave. So that's important distinction. So they'll test for HIV when they come in, but not before they're released from prison. And HIV/AIDS, it's transmitted in prison in the same exact manner as it is in the general population through bodily fluids, dirty needles, tattooing, drugs, sex, right? Now, if we look at a mental disorder, in 1960, we really see a mass closing of public hospitals and institutions. And it put our individuals with major mental disorders on the streets. Oftentimes they had no safety net, no family. So we see that the incarceration rate of someone who has a major mental disorder is about 4 times that of someone who is not disordered. I will tell you, because this is my area, and one interesting fact, that the largest mental health facility in the United States, the largest public mental health institution in the United States, is the Los Angeles County Jail. So kind of characterizes kind of what happens with mental disorder. But the staff is really ill-equipped and unprepared. They really just don't know how to deal with it. And you might see other prisoners who will try to exploit individuals with major mental disorders, so they have to be protected from others who might exploit them. And then you have a very small percentage of individuals with major mental disorders who are violent themselves, and then you would have to protect other prisoners from them. But once they actually enter prison, they stay in prison longer because there's kind of this inability to really follow prison rules. They don't get a lot of treatment. Also, we'll see people enter prison without a disorder, and they'll develop a disorder once they're in prison. So there are a lot of issues and interesting things that happen in regards to mental disorder. So sometimes a picture is worth 1,000 words. So here we have a picture of a prison that is definitely overcrowded. This is what it is meant when we say stacking prisoners. You can really let your imagination run wild as to what types of problems that this situation that's depicted in this picture can really cause. I mean, it's a serious issue. It's a dangerous issue. Interestingly enough, the Supreme Court has determined that overcrowding is not by itself cruel and unusual punishment. But let's talk about prison capacity. So prison capacity is the size of a correctional population, is the size of the correctional population an institution can effectively hold. And there are really 3 types of prison capacity. The first one is rated capacity. And this usually yields the largest inmate capacities. It refers to the size of the inmate population that a facility can handle according to the judgment of experts. Now we have operational capacity. This is the number of inmates that a facility can effectively accommodate that's based on an appraisal of the institution's staff and their programs and services. Design capacity is the smallest, right? So it yields the smallest numbers. It refers to the inmate population that an institution was originally built to handle. And it will show the highest amount of overcrowding. So let's talk about some rights of prisoners. So prisoners' rights have a basis in the Constitution and the law external to the institution, but they can really be thought of as conditional rights. So they're constrained by legitimate needs of actual imprisonment. So there is protection from harm, which is based on the 8th Amendment, that inmates have the right to food, water, and shelter. Protection from foreseeable attack, protection from predictable and predatory sexual attack, and protection against suicide. So let's start talking about prison subculture, but let's start with total institution, right? So prisons are considered total institutions. This is where the same people work, recreate, worship, eat, sleep together daily. It's an enclosed facility separated from society both socially and physically, and inhabitants share all aspects of their daily lives. So residents of total institutions, they may be sent there forcefully. They're cut off from larger society, but they'll operate like small societies, and they're going to form a distinctive value system and lifestyle. Prisons have a distinct culture. And this culture is really consistent among prisons across the United States. It seems to develop independently of the plan of the prison or of prison administrators. And it really evolves to reflect the concerns and the experiences of the wider culture. Now, inmates undergo a process of prisonization in which they learn these convict values, attitudes, roles, and language that really makes up this prison subculture. Now, one study said there was really 5 elements to kind of this prison code or this prison subculture. And the first one is, of course, don't interfere with the interest of other inmates. You don't rat on anybody. You play it cool. You do your own time. You don't whine. You be a man. Of course, you see that kind of those masculinity values coming through there. Don't exploit other inmates. And don't break your word. And lastly, don't be a sucker. Don't trust guards or staff. So let's dive a little bit deeper into the male inmates world. Okay, so we first really have to talk about the pains of imprisonment. So this is a deprivation of liberty, goods, services, heterosexual relationships, autonomy, and personal security, right? So remember, there's no free world counterpart of the violence that's experienced in prison, right? So the pains of imprisonment, you have a deprivation of your liberty. You can't just go out to McDonald's or Kroger and get whatever you want to eat or drink. There's no heterosexual relationships to be had. You don't get to direct your own behavior, so there's no autonomy. And again, there's no personal security. Now, we found that when you enter prison, there are really 4 different ways that you can adapt to these pains of imprisonment. The first one is doing time. So this is really someone who's going to view their incarceration as a brief, inevitable break in their criminal careers. This is kind of what we see depicted in the movies when we look at like mob bosses going to jail. Or going to prison. But this could also refer to dealers, right? So it's just a cost of doing business. You avoid pain, you seek any kind of pleasure, you live the inmate code. You're going to fill your days with activities, you'll make a few friends, you'll do what's needed to survive, and you'll get out. Then we have gleaning. So gleaning is an adaptive role that prisoners will try to take advantage of prison programs so that they really better themselves and improve their process for success after release. Jailing are inmates who are going to seek power and influence in the prison society. They often become key figures in the politics and the economy of prison life. Often these individuals they were state-raised youths, and they've spent much of their life living in an institutional setting, and they've really adopted few values of free society. They really choose to cut themselves off from the outside world. Now we have the disorganized criminal. And this describes the inmate who cannot develop any of the other 3 orientations. So they may be of low intelligence or have psychological or physical disabilities. And they're really inmates who just can't adjust to prison life. They'll develop emotional disorders. They might attempt suicide. They're definitely going to violate prison rules. So aside from the way that one might adapt to the pains of imprisonment, we also have inmate types. So this is research that's kind of been done to discuss like the typologies of inmates in general. And they came up with 9. So the first one is we have the mean dude, right? So this is an inmate who's adjusted to prison culture by being violent. And other inmates know it's just best to leave this person alone. We have the hedonist. They're going to build their life around the limited pleasures available. So they'll smuggle contraband, they might engage in some homosexuality, gambling, drug running, those kind of things. And by the way, whatever you can get in the outside world, you can get on the inside world. So if you can get it in society, you can get it in prison. There's also the opportunist. The opportunist takes advantage of rehabilitative services, schooling, trade training, counseling, and generally this person's well liked by the staff of the prison. You have the retreatist. Quite honestly, this would probably be me in prison. They psychologically retreat. So if there's drug and alcohol, if it's available, depression, mental disorder will probably develop. You have a legalist, they become the jailhouse lawyer. A radical, so they see themselves as a political prisoner. They're a victim of an inequitable distribution of wealth in society. And the prison staff is just not sympathetic to this individual. They're really not well liked by prison staff. We have the colonizer. This is an inmate who thinks of prison as their home. They don't look forward to leaving and living outside of prison. They typically hold positions of power or respect among the inmate population. They may actually commit new crimes to return to prison. You have the religious prisoner. This is a prisoner who professes a strong religious faith, may be born again. Staff tends to be very suspicious of these prisoners, especially those who seem to be overzealous. And then you also have the realist. Confinement is the natural consequence of a criminal activity and the unfortunate cost of doing business. They're going to live by the code, of course, avoid trouble, continue the life of crime, of course, once they're released. And then we also have the gangbanger. That was kind of recently added as a 10th. Inmate type, and it's almost self-explanatory, right? So a gangbanger on the outside would be the same as a gangbanger on the inside. So if we talk about the prison economy, just like anyone else, prisoners are consumers. They want goods and services. So generally prisoners have prisoner bank accounts in which family can deposit money or money earned can be deposited. Prisons will typically have a prison store which has items like soap, cigarettes, chips, peanut butter, candy. This store, of course, in no way meets the demand of its consumers, and so there's always an underground economy where they'll swap cigarettes, sex, protection for contraband, and that's including drugs. So, as I mentioned before, violence in prison has no free world counterpart. Terror and fear of someone can last years with no end. Generally, we see about 28 attacks per 1,000 inmates. Gangs exist in prison. As much as 60% of the prison population may belong to gangs. It's probably higher than that. Generally, in a maximum security prison, in maximum and medium security prisons, you almost are forced to join a gang when you arrive. Gangs are very much segregated by race within prison. And I think we mentioned before that there are about 18,000 assaults on prison staff annually. Okay, so let's move on to jails. So jails are locally operated. They're short-term confinement facilities. Their original purpose was the confinement of suspects following arrest and waiting trials, but we currently use them to confine those that are convicted of misdemeanors. So typically we're looking at less than 1 year of sentence. Some felonies, especially when we have large prison overcrowding, as well as holding suspects following arrest and awaiting trial. So if we look at some of the characteristics of jails, we'll see in 2017, 10.6 million admissions to city and county jails. That actually is a 19% decline since 2007, so it's heading in the right direction. The 10.6 million admissions doesn't necessarily mean that 10.6 million people were admitted to jail because one person could come back multiple times, right? But 10.6 million admissions. So each time someone was admitted to a city or a county jail. The average daily population is very important. It is 746,000 inmates. So on any given day, there's an average population of all of the jails in the U.S. of 746,000 inmates. The average time someone spends in jail is about 26 days. Now, this is significantly more for an individual with major mental disorders. So they tend to spend way more time in jail once they enter. From 2015 to 2017, the jail incarceration rates for whites actually increased about 12%, while the rate for blacks decreased about 23%. Again, we're going to still see that there is a significant disparity. Generally, we're looking at about 50% white, 34% African American, which is disproportionate to the 13% representation in the general population, and about 15% Hispanic. In 2017, males were incarcerated in jail at a rate of 394 people per 100,000 males in the U.S., and that's about 6 times that of females. Okay, sorry for the Star Wars music that came on in the background. My son is very much into Star Wars right now, and so we set the ringer on my phone to play Star Wars music. So that's what you heard. It wasn't at all anything related to the PowerPoint slide. So I paused it as quick as I could, but you probably heard a little bit of it. So really the last thing we need to talk about on this slide is that jails employed about 226,000 full-time staff at mid-year in 2017. The inmate to correctional officer ratio is about 4.2 to 1. So for every correctional officer, there are at least 4 inmates. And lastly, there are about 3,365 jails in the U.S. Most of these jails are actually small. They're really designed to hold 50 or fewer inmates. We do have mega jails that are huge, like Los Angeles County, New York City. All of our jails in Metro Atlanta. So we have a mega jail in Cobb. We have a mega jail in Atlanta, in Fulton County, in DeKalb County. And one of the things about mega jails is they're large enough really that they can not only handle what they need as far as that area, but they are regional in the sense that areas that don't have jails bring their inmates to the mega jail. And it's always interesting to know that the largest 50 jails hold almost 30% of all jail inmates. Okay, that's all we have for prisons and jails right now. Thanks so much.
Okay, thanks for joining me. Please feel free to reach out if you have any questions.